Well, hello and welcome to another edition of Talk with the Badge. I am Cheryl, and we've got a very important discussion today about a problem that seems to be growing and getting more alarming and more concerning, especially for us parents and citizens. And we're going to find out today what we can do to help Sacramento County fight human trafficking in all of its different forms. We've got a panel discussion today with Sacramento County Detective Fry, Sergeant Saito, and Sacramento County Deputy District Attorney Martin. Thank you and welcome. Thank you for informing us. Maybe we should start by defining what human trafficking is, because I think a lot of people have an idea what it is, but it's so much more encompassing and in some ways much more subtle than people realize.
So human trafficking is the exploitation of labor services and commercial sex work. It's usually done by force, fear, false promises, coercion, duress, so on and so forth, where exploiters will seek out their victims, whether they're vulnerable or not, whether they're promising, hey, I can get you a job, I can get you a house, get you cars, and then once they come over, whether they're international or if they're here domestically, and then they start becoming exploited, and then they're trapped in that lifestyle as the exploiter continues to use force, fear, coercion, duress to continue to exploit them.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point that out, because it's not like you see in the movies, although that can be one form it takes, but it can be much more subtle. Someone can pretend to be your boyfriend. If you've led a troubled life at home and maybe you're a runaway, or maybe you're trying to break away free from an abusive home life. I mean, there's so many different subtleties to it, but these traffickers can look like a very normal person next door.
They could.
Yeah. So this is a huge industry. Obviously, it wouldn't be growing and it wouldn't be so concerning if there weren't so much money behind it, which fuels it. How big of an industry are we talking about?
So it was a study that was done just a few years ago, and they estimated that in human trafficking, including labor trafficking and commercial sex trafficking, it's about a $150 billion a year industry.
Wow. That is a lot of money. What are some of the signs of someone that's being trafficked?
I'll go ahead and jump in with that. As far as signs of somebody being trafficked, it can be very difficult to see. I think a lot of people have an idea that it's going to look something like the movie Taken or something else off of TV, and it's really a lot more hidden than that. So what you would typically see is somebody that looks like potentially a domestic violence victim, but it's so much more complicated. So you are going to see somebody who is submissive, who is very withdrawn, has a difficult time with relationships with others, and typically they're going to come from a rather troubled background. Not always, there's always exceptions, but the vast majority that we've worked with over the years have come from a very troubled background and have quite a few vulnerabilities on top of vulnerabilities, which is what led them into trafficking in the first place, unfortunately.
Is there an average age of someone that is trafficked?
The average or common age of entry for girls is in the 12 to 14-year-old range, and for boys, it's around 11 to 13.
And that's for sex trafficking.
And that's typically for sex trafficking, yes. Yeah. Labor is like kind of a different animal altogether in terms of vulnerabilities and methods of entry and so on.
What are some of the things that, because, traffickers have gotten more and more sophisticated as they attempt to elude prosecution and to make more money off of more victims. What are some of the ways currently that traffickers are identifying and targeting their victims? How are they finding them?
Well, I would say that probably one of the ways that it really jumps out is going to be social media, unfortunately. I know from cases that I worked and cases that Detective Fry worked as well, you're going to see a lot of victims on social media who are unfortunately giving the traffickers a lot of clues. There's going to be a lot of references to I want to make money. There are going to be stories in their feed talking about problems they're having at home, problems they're having with their parents, problems they're having at school. And traffickers are going to recognize those as being added vulnerabilities for that victim. And they can, in fact, target those victims. And because social media being the way it is, it's basically free. The traffickers can put out the same sort of invitation to 100, 200, 500 victims, and it doesn't cost them a penny, and they only need a couple to answer back for it to be successful.
Casting a wide net.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the things you do see on Instagram quite often, especially with young women that are like post, and this is not, victim shaming at all, because like we all like to look our best in our photos, right? We like those likes and those comments from our friends, but a lot of times, you're posting a picture of a night out with the girls or a day at the beach, and you will see people you don't even know posting, "Your pictures are great, fire, collab." Is that maybe something that a trafficker, is that maybe a tactic they would use in that casting that wide net?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. One of the common things that you're going to see is low self-esteem amongst victims, low, vision of self-worth, and so any sort of positive reinforcement they're getting from anybody, whether it's about their looks, whether it's about their outfit, their hair, their nails, anything like that. Since predominantly our victims are young girls, when they start to get that sort of positive feedback, even from a stranger, it can prompt a conversation, and it can lead down a very dangerous path.
What are some other things that make someone maybe vulnerable to being targeted by a trafficker?
Well, a lot of our victims have been previously sexually abused, so they've gotten used to kind of being seen, even at a really very young age, as a basically object of sexual interest. And so now, even at 11, 12, 13, they've kind of been conditioned to see themselves like that. And so when an adult man shows that type of interest in them, whereas a kid who hasn't had that kind of attention is probably going to be kind of freaked out by it, tell their parents. The victims that we're working with think that's fairly normal and are responsive to that.
Is it a case of where if someone has been abused from a very young age and sees that as normal, they might see the absence of that kind of attention as weird and do things to attract that type of attention?
Yeah, absolutely. That trauma has kind of conditioned them to seek out situations that are risky and dangerous, and so they are looking for that as part of their kind of just normal routine.
Yes, you'll see that quite a few of the victims don't really understand what normal sexual boundaries are, because it's probably, I think the studies I've seen is in the 80 to 85% of trafficking victims have been a prior victim of sexual abuse, and they don't understand what that is. They don't understand that it's not normal to have to perform sex acts on men for money. They think that that's just the way things are, because they simply don't know any better.
You also see part of that dynamic is, especially if they were abused by an older man, that these traffickers, these exploiters, really specifically try to fill a father role in their lives. And in kind of the subculture of exploitation of young girls, the exploiters often require their victim to call them daddy, or some variation of that. And so it's this really shockingly explicit way that they are drawing on that dynamic of that girl having a absent or abusive father figure.
Which stands to reason it would be reinforced by money being a factor, and they could see their abuser as a provider.
Right.
They
And
also-
a protector.
And the exploiters are also, they'll sell a dream. Basically, they'll tell their victims, hey, look, you come here, you work with me, I can get you cars, I can get you houses, and get you jewelry. And they basically sell these high value items to their victims. So it entices their victims to want to be with this person and do what that person wants in order to fulfill that. Where then in the back end, victims are rarely getting any of those things that were promised, but the exploiter is making all the money.
The exploiter is living the dream, but the victim rarely gets to, or they might get a taste of it, just enough to keep them coming back. And I don't want to jump ahead, was there anything else you guys wanted to add about the victimology and the profile of the victim that we didn't touch on?
I guess we could add in that another thing that we see quite commonly is going to be an involvement with Child Protective Services, Health and Human Services, something along those lines. It's going to be probably, 9 out of 10 victims are going to have prior contact with CPS. And it doesn't necessarily mean that their parents have done anything wrong. It could just be a series of circumstances where their parents are not available, killed, issues with other family members, any number of reasons. But each of those things is an added piece of trauma, it's an added vulnerability. And the victims we work with don't just have one or two, they have a dozen or more. So trying to address just one vulnerability factor like housing doesn't really do enough, it doesn't go deep enough.
The other thing I would add too is that when we talk to victims, like John said, their age of entry might be 12, 13, 14, where they were initially trafficked, and probably at some point they were rescued and recovered and brought somewhere safe. But they often then return to that lifestyle. And when we talk to them, a lot of times the reason that they say is that once they're in someplace safe and stable, it doesn't feel normal to them anymore. They feel like it's too quiet. They need to go back to this risk that adrenaline is almost addictive to them. And so there's a lot of psychological factors that keep drawing them back to the life. So even by the age of 16, 17, they may have had a series of exploiters. And they do keep going back, even though they even have some insight that it's not good for them. It's not a good lifestyle. There's a draw for them once they've been conditioned that way.
We've also seen, and not in all cases, because every case is different, but a lot of the juveniles have history of being a missing person or runaways. It's pretty common to see that. I said it's not every case, but if they have history of being a runaway or a missing juvenile, there's at times what they're doing is they're running away from their family so they can go be with what they believe is their boyfriend, when their boyfriend's really their exploiter.
Yeah. What role does substance abuse play?
I think there's kind of a misconception that it's a significant reason that women maybe or girls participate in prostitution. Certainly we have victims who are using illegal substances or abusing things like drugs or like alcohol and marijuana, but I tend to see it not as the driving factor as much as the psychological manipulation at play. Occasionally you will get the addict who is participating in this lifestyle because they just need money for their addiction. But I think from what I see, that tends to be rare. I don't know if...
Yeah, I would agree with that. There are the group of trafficking victims that are certainly addicts, and it was their addiction that drove them into that level of desperation where they're willing to sell themselves so they can feed that beast. However, it is by far going to be the psychological manipulation and control. There will be some drugs mixed in there, and in some cases we've had traffickers that have specifically given their victims opioids, knowing that opioids are very difficult to kick and they're very habit forming, and then will hold that over their head and only give them enough to not feel sick at a time. So we do see that, and it is a controlling factor, and it's even written in the law in California that is recognized as a controlling factor. But ultimately, it's going to be the psychology of the relationship that really holds them in place.
Mm-hmm. And we do see traffickers on the other side too, giving their victims drugs that will keep them awake so they can work for longer, or drugs that will warm them up so they can be outside on the blade or the stroll areas and not be as cold, things like that. So it is a tool that traffickers use, but maybe not the driving factor.
Well, it sounds like the real drug is trying to appease or get the approval of the abuser.
Yeah,
that's true.
Is there a profile of your typical trafficker, or is that also across the board and hard to stereotype?
I think it kind of depends, because anybody can be involved in sex trafficking, even as an exploiter. But I haven't seen a specific type where you can't just walk down the street and you're like, yep, that's an exploiter. It's just, it all depends on who they are as a person and if they're okay with mentally being okay exploiting women as sex workers, and then having to potentially face, law enforcement and then potential prison cases or prison time.
Are there any red flags that someone could identify? Let's say they meet somebody on a dating app. I mean, I'm sure dating apps are used by traffickers as well. Things like Tinder, Hinge, things like that. What are some of the red flags that might tip someone off like, oh, hey, this guy has some ulterior motives that could be very harmful to me?
I would say anytime you're getting conversation that's going beyond what would be a normal date or just normal flirting or something like that, there's going to be conversation about we can build a dream together, for example. We can have our lives together. I can get you out of that bad situation. Some language like that would be concerning. Anything that's going beyond the normal flirting or dating type conversation.
Selling a dream right off the bat when you don't even really know the person.
Yes.
Big red flag.
Or inquiring about those things that would be vulnerabilities, wanting to know more about your bad situation. While that might seem like care, it can also be a way that they're trying to find out then how they can present themselves as a solution to that problem. Or inquiring about how they make their money. Are they short on cash, that type of thing.
Let's talk for a minute about the traffickers themselves. We've talked a little bit about maybe the profile of what they might look like or how they might behave, some red flags. What are the penalties if someone is caught for this and they're prosecuted? I mean, it's pretty serious.
Yeah, it's going to depend on their criminal history, but they can get very quickly up to 20 years in prison for trafficking, and then they'll also be required to register as a sex offender for the rest of their life if they're convicted of human trafficking. And again, depending on their criminal history, maybe what other assaults or injuries were inflicted, or whether there was other sex crimes that were committed against this victim by the trafficker, which there often is, these can become very lengthy prison sentences. We had somebody who went to trial a few years ago and was convicted and got, I think, 92 years to life for trafficking a minor. So I'm really proud to work in California. We have some of the toughest penalties for human trafficking. And I think our criminal statutes are really designed to see those who take money from sex workers in an exploitative way, to see that as a crime, and to give us a lot of tools as prosecutors to take enforcement measures against it.
I would throw in, as far as the traffickers themselves, the question comes up, how do traffickers become traffickers in the first place? From the outside, it looks so shocking and disturbing, that kind of a world. One of the things that we have to remember is that a lot of the traffickers are growing up in the same type of environment that the victims are as well. A lot of the same factors that we would see leading boys towards gang behavior, that same environment is leading girls towards prostitution behavior. Part of it is also multi-generational. They will often have uncles, cousins, their father, whoever, that has been involved in that. People in the neighborhood have been involved in that. So it doesn't seem that strange. Now, it's not to say that anybody who grows up in a rough neighborhood is all of a sudden going to be likely a trafficker. There are some other things thrown in there on top, and without giving any sort of a psychological diagnosis, we're going to see a lot of antisocial behavior going on with a lot of these folks, a lot of narcissism, a lot of basically lack of concern and empathy for others, because you can't do what these guys do if you have empathy towards people. You just can't. And so those are some of the things that we're going to see. And if you see those types of things in somebody you suspect of trafficking, maybe that is the road that they've gone down.
Yeah. And once again, a lot of times the victims see the trafficker as their boyfriend. Yeah. But there are red flags that would indicate that, no, this is not the case. And one of those would be exploiting it, maybe encouraging them to do this work for their life, for their future, so we can go on a fancy vacation. Would that be some of the things that would be a tip-off to the victim, that this is not your boyfriend, this is your abuser?
Yes, it definitely would. And oftentimes when Detective Fry, or back when I used to do it as a detective, when we would interview victims, they would honestly, in their minds, tell you this is their decision. They're the ones that wanted to do it. The trafficker doesn't really want them to do this kind of stuff, but they do it because he needs the money. And if anything goes wrong, it's their own fault. And they're conditioned to think that way. So they just, in a way, don't know any better. And it's a challenge at times to slowly point that out to victims without coming out and saying, look how dumb you were, how could you fall for this? Because nobody wants to look like a fool. And it's just a realization that they're going to have to come to over time, which is why it's so important to have the community-based partners, so you don't have law enforcement trying to provide those sorts of long-term services. That is better suited to another group altogether.
Absolutely.
There's various types of traffickers too, though. There's some called like a Romeo exploiter, where it's like that boyfriend-girlfriend lifestyle, and it works its way up into a violent commercial sex exploiter, where the women or even men are being physically beaten, emotionally traumatized, and they're just beaten down, whether physically or emotionally, to the point where they don't know any better. And if they want to try and get out of that lifestyle, then their exploiter continues the trauma towards them, and they know that if they were to leave, they're just going to get hurt worse. This lifestyle, exploiters we've kind of just crunched numbers, and we talked about, as a sex worker, if she was to work 7 days a week at $500 a day, which is a pretty low number, many victims are making upwards of $1,000, if not more a night. So in 24 hours, they're making $1,000. So, but we'll say $500. And if an exploiter was to have 3 of those victims in 1 year, he's making $547,000 tax-free. And that's what the victims are putting in, and he's getting the benefit of it. And the reason it's so lucrative, and especially in exploiters like doing it, is because there's very low risk to them. They're not the one that's walking the blade or the public roadway, sidewalk, commonly utilized for commercial sex work, but they're not in a hotel room, they're not meeting these random guys. The exploiter's just sitting back, letting their victims do all the work, and then they tell their victims, well, let me hold the money, I'll keep it safe, and now they maintain control of everything. And they'll, hey, I'll get your nails done, I'll get your hair done, I bought you this outfit, isn't that enough? Well, when they were promised cars, houses, this lavish lifestyle. So exploiters use a lot of control over their victims, and it's extremely lucrative. Because if a girl's walking the street, law enforcement contacts her exploiter's hiding in the background, watching the whole thing. She goes to jail, that's fine, she's gonna get out later, and then he can continue to exploit her and continue to make that money. Where, like, if someone was selling narcotics is, you're walking around with a pound of crystal meth, it's chances of you getting caught are a lot higher, and you're going to go to jail for a lot more time than just an overnighter. So they utilize this new commercial sex work as pretty much being the new dope, new narcotics, and it's a highly lucrative business.
I would add in, I know from interviews that we've done over the years with victims, we can recognize a lot of the psychological factors that are there. But if we were to ultimately ask the victim, and they were being honest with us, why do you keep doing this? They don't really see a way out. They just don't. Even though we might, from the outside, see, like, look, you can go back to school. There's other things you can do with yourself. I think, and Detective Fry can jump in, but I would say that the primary thing, if you were to ask a victim in the middle of an interview, like, why do you keep doing this? It would be they just honestly do not see a way out of it.
Right. Well, and they're also trapped in that cycle of trying to please their trafficker and get that approval and working towards that dream. That's never going to happen.
One thing I would just add too is that, we've talked a lot about this lifestyle that involves prostitution, and it's not just that we're looking saying, okay, sex work is bad, we want to eliminate that. This really is a very high risk lifestyle for these women. They're regularly raped and sexually assaulted by sex buyers. They're robbed. It's being especially out on the street is very risky. They can be assaulted by other people who are out there. Obviously, the risk of sexually transmitted diseases and other health issues is very high. I mentioned RESET, which is the collaborative court, and in the first couple of months that I was participating as the DA for that court, we had 2 participants who ended up passing away. I think one was from a drug overdose and one was murdered. So this is a very high-risk lifestyle, and that is why we think it's important to address this as a community and help these victims get to some place that's safer and more stable.
And just to kind of piggyback off of that, it's also when these girls or even guys are meeting with these sex buyers, the demand in this, these sex buyers are paying for a service. I'm giving you money, I'm going to get what I want out of this money. And they will do absolutely anything to get what they want. So, and that's where, these girls are sexually assaulted or violently raped. And the girls take it, and their exploiters are like, that's your job.
It is an ever-growing and ever-concerning problem. What things should parents be doing? I mean, obviously you can't protect your kid from every danger out there, but it sounds like a lot of things can be done at home to not only educate your kids, but also to help protect them against these attacks that are coming against them out there in the world. What are some things that we as parents can be doing?
Monitor their cell phones. I know juveniles are constantly, even us as adults too, but they're constantly on their cell phones, constantly using social media apps. Just as a parent, just monitor their phones. I know it's time consuming. I can't imagine trying to go through however many social media apps are out there now and trying to go through each one, however many times, either a month or a year, but it's trying to stay up on that and just start looking for signs. Who are they communicating with? Can they identify who that person is? Oh, is this just a friend? Okay, well, who's your friend? Sometimes that's their friend is now their boyfriend, or is their boyfriend, or potentially their exploiter.
Yeah, well, I mean, you see it on the news too. 11, 12-year-old girls going missing, and they end up with some 40-year-old man they met on Instagram or whatever. That happens a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it can be very challenging as a parent, and I have 2 teenage daughters as well, trying to essentially have a decent conversation and a decent relationship with them. While it sounds kind of corny and overly simple, because I recognize it's definitely not, having open lines of communication with your kids is a really big factor. And it is absolutely important to see what they're doing online on their phones. The challenge can be doing it in such a way that you're trying to explain that you are looking out for them and you're not trying to get them in trouble. That's not the goal. Maybe eventually it becomes the goal, unfortunately, but the goal is that you're trying to keep them out of trouble as a parent, and trying to explain that to teenagers can be a pretty challenging thing.
Oh yeah, because they think you're trying to ruin their fun.
Yeah.
In the case of maybe a single mom, the father is not around, he might be in another state, or for whatever reason the dad is not in the picture. It sounds like lack of a father figure leads to a huge vulnerability for victims. What are things that maybe a single mom can do to cover that gap?
Like a really big cultural question, right? Because it's a vulnerability for a lot of things, not just human trafficking, but domestic violence as well. And so, I mean, I think probably the most obvious answer is if you can introduce good father figures, if there's a grandfather or somebody who is safe, to encourage those relationships. But I mean, you have to be so careful even with that. So, I mean, I think it really goes back to what John said, which is keeping open lines of communication, not trying to hide these facts from kids, even maybe kids who you think are younger than should be exposed to the reality of human trafficking, even having conversations with your older elementary school kids about these risks.
What's the conversation that parents should be having with their kids about things like OnlyFans, where it seems like easy money, right? People pay you money for pictures of your feet or whatever. I mean, it goes beyond that, of course. But I feel like that's a really important conversation that parents need to be having with their kids. And I can also understand from the kids' point of view where that lure of that money for seeming nothing, it can be very attractive.
Yeah, it's really objectifying the person that's, I guess, on the receiving end of the money. They're unfortunately learning life's lesson that pictures of them, their body, whatever it is they're doing, that those things have value, and that is how they are valued. And while it sounds sort of esoteric and abstract, when we talk about it here, we can see the real life, ramifications of that as we go forward. OnlyFans and any sort of things like that, any sort of modeling, stripping, we would have those two. It is kind of a gateway, unfortunately, to trafficking. It is this constant reconditioning of that person's brain that this is their value, this is their only value. And depending on what phase they are in with a trafficker, who's at one point showing affection and then also at the same time reminding them, yeah, this is your only value. This is the only value that you have, is selling your body. And since they've been doing it for a while, it doesn't seem, well, it would seem shocking to us if someone were to just come out of the blue and start talking to us that way. For someone who's already been involved in something like that, it just seems kind of normal.
Yeah. Well, and unfortunately, it's a trap, because once you start seeing yourself as a commodity, selling yourself as a commodity, you're going to attract people that see you as a commodity,
Yeah.
and that's all. And that love and affection, that like real acceptance, it's going to be elusive as long as you keep treating yourself like a commodity and allowing other people to.
And you said, are traffickers on dating websites? Absolutely. And they're also on OnlyFans and Snapchat Premium, and using those as a forum for recruiting as well.
So pervasive. So what is Sacramento County doing to combat human trafficking?
So with our agency, there's 3 detectives that are assigned to human trafficking. We have other duties as well, but human trafficking is a portion of it. Sacramento Police Department has a team dedicated to human trafficking, and all the other agencies here within the county have a team that works human trafficking cases. We collaborate together once a month. We meet now via Zoom, but with the DA's office and all other investigators, as well as Child Protection Services, the probation, U.S. Attorney's Office. There's more. There's like 60 to 70 people that show up in these meetings, and we just roundtable and kind of collaborate together. Hey, what's going on? What have you seen? What can we help with? Stuff like that. We do undercover operations, trying to basically either find the exploiters, contact the sex buyers, or the Johns, the tricks, the dates, whatever you want to call it. And then we contact the victims as the sex workers, and we try to provide them resources. We have affiliates with CASH, which is Community Against Sexual Harm, who majority of them are victims of human trafficking previously, and they work for this agency, and they provide resources to current victims of human trafficking or just commercial sex work. And we help, or they help us. They'll come out to operations with us, and we try to get these victims the help that they need to get out of the life or the commercial sex lifestyle, and try and take the right step forward and be a solid, functioning, legitimate person in the society.
I would throw in, sorry.
No, you go.
I would throw in that one of the other things that we are doing currently in the county is in the jail. We have, through CASH, a program that CASH runs. It's not, we don't run it, but it's called Ending the Game. It was designed by a survivor, and it is typically used in an out-of-custody setting, but they have modified it to use it in custody. And because, unfortunately, pardon the pun, but you have a captive audience there, and you have a lot of the women that are in custody and remain in custody have a lot of vulnerabilities. They've got a lot of marks against them for one reason or another, whether it's drug use, theft, anything you can think of, abusive relationships. And so many of them, if they haven't been victims of trafficking, they've certainly been approached about it throughout their lives. And so by moving a program like that into the jail setting and allowing that sort of thing to run, it can have a very positive effect. It gives a lot of the women, the potential victims and victims, ideas of what you can do when you get out of jail, because a lot of them unfortunately just don't know. They're going to walk out the front doors, not have any idea what their next step is, and that makes them so much more vulnerable for approach by a trafficker.
Right. They don't realize that their better life is in their own hands and not in this dream that someone sells them.
Yeah, so CASH, when we say resources, they're talking about vocational resources, vocational training. If there is substance abuse issues at play, then resources regarding that, housing resources. A lot of these young women are mothers, and so resources to help them be good moms. And so we're really trying to connect them with wraparound services so that when all of those things start to become addressed, they don't end up falling prey to these vulnerabilities again. And in addition to the program in the jails, we have a program in court called Reset. It's a collaborative court. So like Billy said, our main purpose out there is not necessarily enforcement against prostitution, but if there is an arrest and a filing of a case for prostitution against a sex worker, then they'll have the opportunity to, instead of getting a conviction on their record, they have an opportunity to participate in reset. So that involves taking a 25-hour class with Cash, and then Cash will also try to address any other needs that they have. They'll have to abide by some conditions like not posting on escort websites and things like that. And if they're successful, then their case gets dismissed. So we're also trying to focus more on that collaborative, rehabilitative approach rather than on criminal convictions for prostitution.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure that's a fear if you are a sex worker, is that you're going to go to jail and locked away forever. But that's encouraging that you're actually addressing the root causes and helping to heal that from the inside out. What's being done on the, so that's, on the supply side, what's being done on the demand side of this equation and this problem?
So that just goes to law enforcement, contacting and doing operations. But it also stems to the community too. I used to work for our contract city, Rancho Cordova Police Department, and I did a presentation at our local hotels where the hotel managers came to one specific hotel. We social distanced, and we talked about signs of human trafficking and what hotels can look for. Something to keep eyes on. Camera systems are fantastic. Little things like that in the community. The hotel staff, they liked it. Within that next week, my phone was blowing up saying, hey, I think I got a sex trafficking thing going on here. Wow. So we would go and we'd check it out. If it was something, cool. If it wasn't, it wasn't. But it's just the more knowledge is power, right? So the more understanding that the community has, and then working with us as law enforcement, we can work together to try and stop the demand.
In addition, on the demand side, the DA's office has put together for the past 5 or 6 years Operation Hotspots. It's an operation with agencies all over the county. In usually a month or two out of the year, we'll try to set up a series of operations that are targeted at undercover contacts with sex buyers and then citing those sex buyers and filing criminal cases against them. Because when we talked to community groups, so some of the feedback we got when we were initially working on this issue was that these young women and girls, they get in trouble for prostitution, but they don't see anything happening to sex buyers, and so we're really actively trying to change that. And it is a huge issue. There's a statistic that something like 1 out of every 20 men has bought sex in the last year, which is actually, I think, a lot. And so that's why you end up with these significant numbers of human trafficking being $150 billion a year industry, because the demand is very significant.
What are the penalties for this?
So the penalties are, it's a misdemeanor, so you get a misdemeanor conviction. You can be on probation. There may be a few days in jail, or these days it's probably more likely you'll be doing community service or something like that. So it's not the most significant crime, but it is a crime, and then there can be collateral consequences as well for having a criminal conviction on your record.
So the more time someone is prosecuted for, it builds?
Yes, we would probably give them more time as part of a deal if they wanted to resolve their case, or the court would give them more time. And then there is, it is a prior, so it shows on their record that they have that prior criminal conviction as well.
And they can have some societal consequences too, whether it's their employer. A lot of times their significant other or kids. It's going to be difficult to truly keep it a secret forever. So once their significant other, their children, their employer find out about what had happened, they can explain it as best they can. But at the end, it's going to be a matter of how people accept or don't accept that kind of activity. That's why, to a large degree, criminal enforcement is helpful for sure. But there needs to be some changes in just simply the way men primarily think and what's acceptable and what's not.
Absolutely. This problem has been a long time coming, a long time building over many decades, even just in the thinking and how women are objectified. But now it's spread, of course, to boys as well. And it's not going to be solved overnight, but what are some of the things that we as the community can do to help support your efforts, and then maybe start turning the tide of how people view each other, and stop the commoditization of human beings?
Well, the big engine that really drives this whole ugly machine is unfortunately going to be on the demand side. If there was no demand, then there would be no supply. And while that sounds really simple, it's a little harder than that. So if there were no men rolling around looking to pay a woman to have sex, which is what usually it is, if those men decided that they'd rather do something else, all of a sudden your supply, your victims, would have to go some other way. But it doesn't work like that, unfortunately. The men, primarily the customers that are driving this whole thing, that's where the money is coming from. And the money is ultimately going to the trafficker, who is just selling a product. So recognizing that, and recognizing the shame that the victims deal with, and that is what really keeps them in place. That low self-esteem, shame about what's going on in their background, shame what they're doing right now, those sorts of things. It's easier said than done, but trying to have a community, a family, a neighborhood that is trying to assist them rather than put them down can be huge. And it's without those sorts of basic human connections, it's going to be really difficult to get out and stay out.
Yeah.
I always tell people probably the biggest thing you can do to help combat human trafficking is supporting the youth who are most vulnerable to it. And so you're probably not going to be out there participating in operations, things like that, but whatever you can do. So maybe that's volunteering with some kind of agency that helps foster youth, something like that. Maybe your kids are in school and they know of a kid who needs some extra support. Being that family that comes alongside them can really make a difference for kids. And those are the youth that we end up seeing. And so that intervention by the community, I think, is something that can make a difference before they end up with us.
And younger than you'd think. I think a lot of programs for at-risk youth might, initially, probably in the good old days, they started targeting high school youth, and they realized, we need to probably go to junior high. And unfortunately, you probably need to even go down 4th, 5th, 6th grade, because they are exposed to that in their environment, and it becomes normalized. And by the time you're hitting 13, 14 years old, it's quite a challenge to change the way that they think and the way that they recognize themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a great starting point for educating all of us about this. What are some next steps if someone wants to learn more? Are there resources or programs that you can recommend that people look into, especially parents?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I would say that there are certainly some national sites that are probably pretty good. You have the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC.org is one of the big ones. They work a lot with the child pornography side of things. Then you also have the Polaris Project, which is the National Center for Human Trafficking as a whole. I'm sure they can be found online. But if they're looking for something more local, certainly we've already mentioned cashsack.org. You've also got Rahab's House, which is City of Refuge, which is another local organization that provides housing and job training for a lot of the women that come out of this. And really just start essentially searching on the internet for some local groups, contact them, and see what you can do to help. They would love to have volunteers, any one of these groups would, and by simply having a conversation with some of the people that work there, and maybe even spending some time out there doing some help, you'll start to see things firsthand and recognize that it's a little more complicated than what you might see on TV.
Yeah. It's a great suggestion.
Yeah, another resource too would be working on reading some literature about being trauma informed. That's the kind of buzzword these days, but it really is such a just key part of this is the trauma that these victims undergo. And so understanding that is going to help people when they do come in contact with victims or those who are at risk for becoming victims. So there's some popular books out there right now about trauma, and I would encourage folks to go out and check that out.
Absolutely. And would you say the catchphrase, if you see something, say something, definitely applies to this? You know, maybe people have been afraid because they're like, oh, you know, that's none of my business. Oh, I'm sure that's not what I think. Like, maybe being more willing to speak up. The worst thing that can happen is maybe everything is fine, but best case scenario, maybe you're saving somebody from a miserable life and a life full of pain.
I have cases monthly where they start because a clerk in a grocery store saw somebody who looked young, maybe wasn't dressed appropriately for the weather, was with someone who appeared to be an older man, and decided to just call and say, I think there might be something going on here. So I mean, we get those cases, and they become filed prosecutions on a very regular basis.
I would also throw in there that while it would be nice to say, you know, if you have these concerns about somebody being involved in trafficking, call the police. I recognize that not every community member is going to feel comfortable talking to the police, and they're concerned about what could happen to that kid. So that is where it is really important to reach out to some of your community partners, those community-based organizations that I had mentioned already, including WEAVE and Women Escaping the Violent Environment, all those other community organizations. They're not going to automatically pick up the phone and call the police or the sheriff's department, but they can provide a lot of resources. And at some point, it may come to the point where they want to actually contact law enforcement. But we recognize that there's only so much we can do on the law enforcement side. We have a lot of criminal type remedies that we can go after, but in reality, this victim is going to need long-term support and assistance, and we'd be reaching out to those community partners as well at some point. So if people don't feel comfortable calling the cops, they can definitely call a lot of our community partners and get help that way.
Yeah, and a lot of very valuable information, I'm sure, as we're all trying to educate ourselves more to help this situation. The National Human Trafficking Hotline, 888-373-7888. In what situation would be appropriate to call that number?
If they suspect human trafficking and they're not willing to call law enforcement or reach out to resources, or if it's something, you hear something going on at the school, you can document it. They will send it out to any of the law enforcement agencies in the area. Because like the NCMEC, we get the tips all the time, and it's something we look into to see, and try and see if there's a way we can figure out what's going on to potentially build a case.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been a very informative conversation. I thank you all for taking the time to educate us and our audience, and hopefully together we can work together and help see those numbers go down instead of growing every year.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for watching and participating in this edition of Talk with the Badge.